Hi, my name is Emily and welcome to my yarn dyeing vlog. I am starting to soak some yarn. I'm pulling out 3 skeins of a fingering weight 80/20 base that I had purchased from Wool to Dye For, and I am putting some reusable zip ties on them to be able to keep them separated and a little more organized. I keep all of my dye stuff in that little set of drawers right there in our messy little office, as you can see. Here you can see where I am pulling out some little mini skeins. I believe these are 2 grams each, and I like to use these as yarn mops or test skeins, and you'll see me use those here on out. So here I am adding all of the yarn that I just put zip ties on into a bucket to soak while I get everything else prepped and ready. So I dye yarn at my kitchen table, and I use a trash bag that I had cut open, taped to it to keep my kitchen table safe from any dye splatters or dye particles that release. It's just an extra precaution, and I don't have to deep clean my kitchen after I'm done dyeing yarn. So you can see me pulling out my little induction burner. I'm washing my pan right now. Just starting to get everything prepped while that yarn is soaking. So enjoy watching me get set up. So let's start dyeing some yarn. I pull out a 2-gram mini skein to sample a couple of different things. I added some water so when I turn on the heat, the yarn does not burn. I spread out the yarn so that way I can start speckling it, because that is my plan for the first skein, is to speckle using the Cabernet color. So I am putting my gloves on. Got some citric acid to add so that way the acid dye will bind to the yarn. I mix that up. Once I'm done mixing, I spread it out again and put on my respirator and get ready to speckle. I'm checking the temperature of the pan because I believe I'm still learning. You need to have some kind of a heat when you're speckling, or it is nice to have the heat. So here you can see me speckling. They're pretty heavy speckles. These gloves do have a texture on the fingers, but I do grab the second set of mini to kind of grab that dye that did not hit the yarn. That is one thing I did not take into account with dyeing these super duper mini skeins. You can see me kind of checking out how that speckling did, and here's a closer look at that. This dye powder did not do fine speckling. as you can see in there. So I'm trying out another method since I didn't like the gloves. I'm using a plastic knife. I was not happy with that either. There could have been just too much water in the pan or what, but I'd give up. I would mix it all up, trying to get that dye to dissolve, and you can see me doing that here. So now I am about to start prepping some dye stock. If you watched my latest podcast, I had said that I was going to do like a sand color base with the Cabernet speckles. I filled that little cup to start mixing my dye stock and then realized I needed to weigh the dye powder first. So I put it all back, tried it out. And you can see me getting my scale here and balancing out it with the cup so I can measure out about 2 grams of the sand dune color of dye powder from Dharma Acid Dyes. And I knew I wanted to do 2 grams of dye because that is a 2% stock solution. I have dyed the tonal before and knew I wanted this as my base color, and so that's where my starting point was. So I'm mixing this pretty good to make sure all that dye is dissolved. Looking back, I wish I would have used some hot water instead of just the cool water that was from there. I'm moving my mini skeins over to a little thing to just sit. And I washed out my pan to start the full skein color. So here you can see where I'm pulling out the first full skein that I am starting to dye. As you'll see throughout this vlog, I do a lot of back and forth. So I fill the pan up with some water, and I'm just using the water from the pre-soaked yarn because it's right there, and why not? So I'm spreading out the yarn, and you'll see me realize, oh, I need to put the dye stock in first before the yarn. So I take the yarn out, put it back in the pre-soak bin, and mix the dye stock into the water that's already there. And then I will add the yarn again to the dye pan. Since I'm wanting this to be a tonal, I am moving it around a lot, trying to make sure the dye hits every bit of the yarn. I'm moving around my zip tie, I'm flipping the yarn and moving it all again. There is some residual heat to it since I was dyeing the mini skeins, but the water was cool, and so it's starting off cool and will gradually heat up. So here I will leave it to sit and let the dye resolve into the yarn. So I'm turning back on the burners and I'm adding citric acid again. Now that the sand dune color has resolved, I am starting to pull out some water because I plan on speckling on top of this. And there was too much water for me to get the fine speckles that I was going for. So I am taking water out of the pan and putting it to the side so that way if I need to use it again, I can. Here you can see me trying to spread out the yarn as much as possible before I start to speckle. I added more citric acid, put on my respirator and gloves, and grabbed the dye powder to start speckling. I did decide to speckle this with my gloved hands, and you can start to see the speckles showing up on the yarn. So I'm trying to move the pan around so the burners hit different spots because I have very little water in here and I did not want the yarn to burn. You can see where I struggled. I had some very heavy dye spots, some little dye spots, and all in all, I probably over speckled this colorway. At this point, I had let the yarn sit on the heat for a little bit, probably about 30 minutes or so, while I sat on the couch and kind of kept an eye on it from the side. But now I am starting to put my respirator on and gloves on, and I'm going to flip it and speckle the other side. So I'm kind of moving around some of those heavier dye spots to see if that dye has dissolved. And I think either I just had troubles with this color. It's the Cabernet color from Dharma Acid Dyes, and I just don't think it was meant to speckle, or I was just too impatient. Because you can see where when I picked up the yarn, there was a whole bunch of residual dye left in the pan and that little bit of water. So I do flip it, I spread it out and try to show off the bare spots a little bit more to get those speckled. Here I am adding more speckles to the second side. I think at this point I had decided that this is not what I was going for. But I went ahead and speckled it more because you can always use a single skein of yarn for socks. At this point, I had decided that I was going to try this again, so here is another skein of yarn from my thing that I added to the soaking yarn. I flipped the yarn yet again to try and look for any bare spots to add more speckles to, but I believe I decided I'm done. I add the rest of the water because it's all melded together and not really speckled anyways, but I want the dye to resolve. I add those 2 mini skeins and their water into a mason jar and add them to the pan so they can get some heat to hopefully get the dye set there. So I let this sit for a little bit. I do add some vinegar to add more acid to see if that will help resolve more dye. This Cabernet color is just difficult. This is about an hour later. I had let that yarn sit on the heat for a little bit while keeping watch of it from over on the couch. You can kind of see it in the bottom left-hand corner there. I've taken it out of the pan to cool, and I am starting to dye the tonals, the 2 tonal skeins of yarn that I'll use for the body of my sweater. And I am doing those in the Cabernet at a 1% dye stock. So I am mixing up the dye stock, and same thing with the sand dune. I really wish I would have used hot water. This is cool water in the pan. Yeah. You can see me moving around this yarn a lot. Same thing with the sand dune. With it being a tonal, I'm trying to get every little bit of that dye around all the yarn. I did add some vinegar for some acid to get the yarn to start binding. I did start this cool, and you saw me turn on the pan to hopefully get it to warm up and to get the acid dye to start binding to the yarn. Now I am washing that first skein of yarn that I did and those 2 little mini skeins. Washing yarn is a lot of work. It's hard on your shoulders. As I'm washing this yarn, you can see there was no dye coming off of it, so that was great. I am taking those skeins of yarn outside to dry out in the sun, and I'm hanging them back on one of our lawn chairs. And you can see my chickens are coming around. They think every time I walk out the front door I've got food for them. Here I am checking the 2 tonal skeins of the Cabernet to see if the dye has resolved. It is not completely resolved, but I was not about to sit and wait another hour for it to resolve. So I set that aside to cool. And here I have a bare skein of yarn with just a tiny bit of water. This is the fourth one that I got pre-soaking. I am using a plastic bag as a glove because the texture on the yellow gloves that I have on those fingers, I figured that was what was causing the dye to be speckled heavily, which it kind of was. You can see where I do have lighter speckles here, which turned out or look great right now, but I'm impatient and I add a whole bunch more speckles. I should have stopped at this point, but I kept going. I should note that I did add some citric acid on top of this pre-soaked skein before I started filming, and so I don't have any water in this either. I think it's just the pre-soaked skein and maybe the little bit of excess water that came with that. So here I'm wiping all the excess speckles off the side because I don't want them to transfer. It's got a bit on that paper towel. And I'm checking out what I've done. Not too sure about it. I want to turn on the heat, but I am so afraid that it will burn the yarn. So I add just a little bit of water underneath, hoping it won't move the speckles, but it does a little bit. And so I add a little bit to each corner, just hoping that'll turn. But you can kind of see where the dye powder is starting to move around within the yarn. One thing I definitely learned with this particular dye powder and trying to speckle it was I am not patient enough. And I add more citric acid, hoping that will set the dye speckles, but I don't believe they did. Here is where I put my hand on my hip and decide this just isn't working for me. It's not going to do what I want to do. So I kind of give up. I did grab a couple more mini skeins to soak up the excess dye on the sides that was bleeding, but it did not help in the way I envisioned. I ended up flipping the yarn to spread it out and speckle the other side. I added a little bit more water because there was hardly any left in there and I was afraid of burning the yarn again. And so here I am spreading it out, trying to get those bare spots shown so I can get them covered up with speckles. Even though this colorway did not turn out the way I envisioned, I still wanted to make sure it was speckled and covered to my liking and didn't have bare spots. My camera does end up shutting off here in a second, so I was not able to film the rest of this colorway. This is the yarn drying. This is the black and white color to see if there's contrast. And here are the finished products.